Bro, he basically said the CIA looked for the slightly broken ones. Not broken, just useful broken. And that is such a wild sentence for a government job. We want the person with just enough damage to stay calm. That is insane, but also somehow believable. The creepy part is how practical it sounds. Like they are not looking for movie spies. They are looking for temperament. Yeah, and temperament is usually just trauma with a suit on. That line is going to upset somebody online, by the way. But it is kind of the thesis here, right? Your childhood wires you, then institutions notice the wiring. Then they either fix you or hire you. Usually hire you because fixing people is expensive. Bro, that is horrible. But okay, the secrecy thing from childhood hit me hard. When you do not feel emotionally held, you learn to become self-contained. And then secrecy starts feeling normal instead of suspicious. That is the scary adaptation. Because it helps you survive, but it also messes with your trust forever. He is basically saying trust can be a weakness in certain environments. I get the logic, but that is a dangerous worldview if you live inside it. Yeah, because then every relationship becomes a negotiation. And every dinner becomes an intelligence operation. Which honestly, for some families, yes. Fair. What I found interesting is he did not romanticize it much. He kept calling it valuable and destructive at the same time. That is the most honest thing he said. Because usually people want a neat origin story. Like, I was lonely, then I became a legend. Exactly, but he is like, no, I was lonely and weird and very good at systems. That is way more real. And it makes the CIA part less glamorous, more industrial. Like they are not choosing James Bond, they are choosing a human pattern reader. A pattern reader with clearance. The part about manipulation versus motivation was interesting too. Because he is trying to say the skill itself is neutral. But the ethics are in how you use it. That is the clean version. The dirty version is, congrats, you can now be more effective at lying. That is exactly why people lean in, though. Because everybody wants leverage in conversation. Especially in business, where people pretend it is all values and then act like wolves. Yeah, business loves to cosplay as morality. Ethics until the quarterly numbers get ugly. Then suddenly everybody is very interested in influence. I also liked that he separated handler and asset so sharply. It sounds boring, but language matters when the whole job is precision. If you confuse your nouns, you might recruit the wrong human being. That would be a bad day at work. But then he turns around and says normal life is full of the same logic. Barriers, motivations, hidden incentives, all of it. That is the part that actually matters to me. Because most people think intelligence work is about secret gadgets. It is mostly about people being predictable and emotionally sloppy. That is brutal, but probably correct. And then he talks about the nuclear missile job like it was spiritual punishment. Bro, underground for 72 hours waiting for the world to end? That is not a job, that is a psychological experiment. And he said half the time you do not even know if the order is real. That is such a terrifyingly elegant system. Because the machine is built on doubt, not confidence. Which is comforting until you remember the machine has nukes. Yeah, very small detail. And the crazy thing is he was bored enough in that job to leave. Not because of ideology, but because he wanted meaning. That feels human to me. He goes from maybe saving children in the Peace Corps to being recruited by intelligence. That is a ridiculous career fork. And the recruitment story itself is so absurdly modern. A pop-up ad for espionage is crazy. The CIA doing growth hacking is nuts. But it also tells you they are not mystical, they are just efficient. They saw a profile and moved fast. That is the part people miss about these organizations. They are less dramatic than the legend and more ruthless. Which is a bad combo for your ego. The childhood stuff also explains why he is so calm talking about morally gray things. If you grow up around emotional scarcity, gray becomes normal. Black and white starts feeling fake. And maybe that is why he is so good at reading people. Because he learned early that the obvious story is rarely the real one. Family dinner taught him field work. Horrific, but yes. I do think there is a real tension here, though. When does useful self-protection become permanent distrust? That is the whole trap. You build armor to survive one environment and then forget to take it off. Then every room feels hostile. And every person feels like a puzzle. Which is exhausting if you are trying to have lunch. Or a marriage. That was maybe the most sobering part of the whole thing. He is successful, but he keeps asking what it cost him. That question is usually where the real story lives. And I respect that he is trying not to pass it on to his kids. Because that is the real test, not whether you figured yourself out. It is whether the next generation gets a lighter load, or at least a different kind of damage. That is such a bleak sentence, man. But it is honest. And honesty is kind of the whole appeal here, even when the honesty sounds like a classified file with feelings. That is a great line, actually. I think we stop here and let that sit, because next part gets even deeper. Yeah, next episode is where the actual tradecraft starts to spill out. And that is where it gets dangerous in the fun way. Wait, the CIA basically told him you are a little messed up? That is such a wild recruitment strategy. But honestly, it makes weird sense for intelligence work. You do not want the safest, most boring person in the room. You want somebody who can sit inside contradiction without melting, which is, unfortunately, a very specific job description. The part that got me was his definition of a spy versus an officer. Because everybody says spy like it is one clean thing. But he is splitting handler, asset, operative, all of it apart. It is very nerdy, but also kind of necessary. And that distinction matters because language changes how people imagine power. If you call everybody a spy, you blur who is actually doing what. And then suddenly every guy in a blazer thinks he is Jason Bourne. Which, to be fair, is already happening everywhere. What I found sharper was the business angle. He is basically saying spy skills are just human skills under pressure. Reading people, spotting lies, controlling your own tells, that is not just espionage. That is sales, leadership, relationships, even parenting. Especially parenting, which is just emotional surveillance with snacks. That is horrible and accurate. But the manipulation part is where people get uncomfortable. He does not pretend it is clean, and I respect that. Most people try to sell influence like it is a workshop with candles. This guy is like, no, sometimes it is just manipulation and motivation in the same coat. That is the disturbing part, because the line is thinner than we like. If you can get what people want, you can move them without force. If you can get what people fear, you can move them faster. And CIA is literally training around that human predictability. That sad rat thing he mentioned sounds like a whole psychological engine. I want the acronym badly, but even without it, the idea is brutal. People are far more programmable by need than they want to admit. Which is why every good salesperson looks like they are just being helpful. Helpful is often just persuasion in nicer shoes. The childhood section changed the whole temperature for me. Like suddenly all the spy stuff stopped being glamorous. It became a coping system first and a career second. No father, cold mother, emotional distance, constant self-reliance. That kind of upbringing can make a person terrifyingly competent, but also weirdly lonely in a way success cannot fix. That line about not feeling loved was heavy, because he is not saying he had no structure. He is saying he had output without warmth, which is a very different kind of damage. Honestly, that is how a lot of high performers are built. Not by love, but by pressure plus permission to be useful. And then they confuse being needed with being loved. That mother line, though, was ice cold. I have to love you, but I choose to love your father is outrageous. That is the kind of sentence that stays in your nervous system forever. You can hear exactly how a kid would build a secret life after that. And then he connects that to lying, secrecy, and trust so directly. That was not him bragging, that was him explaining the wiring. Still unsettling because he is almost too calm about it. But maybe calm is what you get when you grew up inside it. He is basically saying trust first people are easier to exploit. Which is depressing, but also explains half the internet. Especially the part where people overshare in comments and then get scammed. I do think the most interesting tension is that he hates parts of his wiring. But he also admits it made him exceptional at his work. That is the hardest adult sentence there is. This thing hurt me, and it also built me. You cannot make that simple without lying. And then he says he is trying not to pass it on to his kids. That is where the whole conversation stops being about CIA and becomes personal. Because every wounded high achiever eventually meets the parent test. Can you stay successful without making your child pay for it? Billion-dollar question, tiny household. And he knows he will mess it up, which is weirdly reassuring. Perfect parents are usually just better at denial. The nuclear missile part was also insane in a quieter way. Because it is not glamorous at all, it is routine apocalypse management. Imagine your job is basically, please do not end civilization today. And you do it for 72 hours underground with one other person. That kind of boredom sounds like a personality test. The fact that he would have launched if ordered is the part people dodge. But that is the whole point of the system. You are not there to feel, you are there to execute. And then he gets pulled from that into the CIA almost by accident. The Peace Corps detour is such a perfect human detail. He wanted to go build huts and teach kids English, and instead got espionage. That is an absurd career fork. But it also says something about timing and appetite. A person at 27 will often say yes to the stranger door if the old door feels dead, especially if the stranger door comes with airline tickets. That part sounded like the opening scene of a spy movie, honestly. Yet it was just bureaucracy with a better wardrobe. What I keep coming back to is how much of this was about unmet needs. Love, trust, recognition, all of it got rerouted into performance. And performance looks impressive right up until it starts eating you. That is the tension he is living inside. Like, are you healed, or are you just highly optimized? Two very different LinkedIn headlines. Bro, that is actually hilarious. The scary thing is people probably learn more from this than from any textbook. Because it is not theory, it is a lived system. And he is openly telling you the system works on ordinary life too. Which means everyone listening should probably get a little more suspicious of themselves. Not paranoid, just awake. That feels like the real point of the whole thing. All right, we have to leave the deepest part for next time. Because once he starts breaking down actual tradecraft, it gets really spicy. Yeah, and probably a little uncomfortable in the useful way. But that is exactly why this story works. He is not selling mystery, he is selling pattern recognition. And that is way more dangerous than a trench coat. Way more dangerous. Episode 2 is where we get into how he actually reads people. And that is where the whole thing really opens up. He is basically saying the scariest skill is noticing patterns faster. And somehow that is less cinematic and more terrifying. Because if people are predictable, then everybody is readable. That is the part that should make business people sweat a little. Forget boardrooms, that is family dinners too. Bro, imagine weaponizing Thanksgiving. He keeps circling back to barriers like life is a sequence of locked doors. And the CIA just learns which key opens which person. That is such a grim way to describe human connection. Also a very effective way, annoyingly. What I like is he does not pretend influence is innocent. He flat out says manipulation has value. That honesty is weirdly disarming, right? It is like, thank you for not wrapping the knife in glitter. But the really interesting move is that he pairs manipulation with motivation. That is the whole business crossover right there. Either push people or align them. One sounds evil, one sounds like leadership. And sometimes they are just cousins. The childhood stuff is where it turns from cool to painful. Yeah, the absent father changes the whole emotional architecture. And then the mother being cold makes the whole house feel transactional. That line about academic success being the substitute for affection hit hard. Because then achievement becomes survival, not ambition. That is why he sounds so comfortable with secrecy. If nobody is emotionally safe, secrets become the furniture. That is a horrifying sentence, but yes. And he is not saying it with self-pity either. He is almost clinically mapping his own damage, which is useful but also a little chilling. Especially when he says CIA likes people who are a little messed up. That is such a brutal recruiting philosophy. Basically, congratulations, your unresolved issues are now a national asset. Bro, imagine getting hired for your trauma. But he is not exaggerating when he talks about moral flexibility. That phrase alone could power a whole episode. Because it sounds like a polite way to say you can compartmentalize anything, which in the wrong hands is a disaster. In the right hands, maybe it is discipline. But that line between discipline and damage is thin. And he is living right on that edge. The nuclear officer part is insane in a completely different way. Dude said he had a key around his neck for nukes. A literal dead man switch lifestyle. And he got there by just doing what he was told. That is the saddest and most military thing possible. Command structure as a personality. That is a very specific type of ambition. And then he describes the job as sitting underground waiting for the apocalypse. How do you not come out of that job weird? You probably do come out weird, just very efficient. Efficiently weird is such a military outcome. The fact that the CIA recruiter hits him through a government website is hilarious. It is such an unglamorous spy origin story. No alleyway, no cigarette, just a pop-up window. Bro got recruited like a software update, and he almost ignores it because it sounds fake. Which makes sense because that whole pipeline is absurd. The fact they overnighted the travel paperwork is cinematic, though. That is when the prank becomes a mission. I also like how he frames the Peace Corps application as the opposite direction. That says a lot about where his head was at. He wanted to build instead of wait to destroy. That is not a small psychological swing. It feels like he was constantly trying to outrun one version of himself. And then the CIA basically says, "Perfect, come here." We love a controlled personality with unresolved childhood stuff. That is evil, but also probably true. The most uncomfortable thing is how much of this is just operational psychology. They are not scouting heroes, they are scouting functions, which is way colder than the movie version. And that coldness is what makes him good at explaining it. He is not romanticizing any of it. Even the success story has this weird emotional tax on it. I think that is the real backbone of the episode so far. Like, the spy skills are cool, but the human cost is the story. And the cost is invisible unless you actually listen, which is probably why he is so obsessed with reading what people do not say. He had a childhood built on unsaid things. Yeah, he was raised in subtext school. The line about trust is maybe the sharpest thing he says. Because if you do not trust anyone, you learn to hide first. But if you trust too easily, you are also exposed. So either way, vulnerability is baked in. That is why this feels bigger than espionage. It is really about how people become who they are allowed to be, and how institutions then reward that wiring, which is a little terrifying when you think about it. Yeah, because then your flaw becomes your job title, and your job title becomes your identity. Welcome to adulthood, apparently. That is such a bleak little landing point, but it is a good one to pause on before the real people reading stuff. Because now we know why he is wired to see the game instantly, and next is how he actually plays it in real life. That is where this gets dangerous in a useful way. Exactly, we are only at the setup and it is already wild. All right, let us leave it there and keep moving. Because the next part is where the people reading really kicks in. And that is where things get properly intense in episode 2.